The morning sun was shining bright through the large windows of Denver International Airport as Robert Johnson checked his watch. It was 7:30 a.m., and his flight to Miami was scheduled to leave at 9:15. He had plenty of time, but Robert was the kind of man who never liked to rush. At 45 years old, he had learned that staying calm and prepared was the secret to success in business. Robert stood tall at 6 feet 2 inches, wearing a perfectly pressed navy blue suit and carrying a leather briefcase that had traveled with him to dozens of cities across the country. His shoes were polished to a shine, and his tie was knotted just right. Anyone looking at him could tell he was a successful businessman, but what they couldn't see was the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. 25 years ago, Robert had started working in the mailroom of a small shipping company in Chicago. Every morning he would sort packages and deliver mail to different offices in the building. The pay wasn't much, but Robert had big dreams. During his lunch breaks, he would read business magazines and study how successful companies worked. At night, he took classes at the community college, learning about finance and management. Year after year, Robert worked his way up. From the mailroom to customer service, then to sales, and eventually to management. But Robert didn't want to work for someone else forever. He wanted to build something of his own. So at 30, he took a big risk and started his own logistics company with just $5,000 in savings. The first few years were tough. Robert worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. He drove delivery trucks, answered phones, and even cleaned the office bathrooms. There were nights when he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But slowly, his hard work began to pay off. His company grew from 1 truck to 5, then to 20, and eventually to over 200 vehicles serving companies across the Midwest. By the time Robert turned 40, his logistics company was worth over $50 million. But he had always been fascinated by something else: airplanes. As a child, he would lie in his backyard and watch planes fly overhead, dreaming about where they were going and who was on them. Now, with the success of his first business, Robert was ready to chase that childhood dream. For the past 3 years, Robert had been quietly studying the airline industry. He spent hours reading financial reports, learning about flight operations, and understanding what made some airlines successful while others failed. He discovered that many smaller airlines were struggling to compete with the big companies, and he saw an opportunity. 6 months ago, Robert learned about Skyline Airways, a regional airline that was in serious financial trouble. The company flew to 15 cities across the Southeast, but poor management and outdated planes had left them on the edge of bankruptcy. Most investors saw Skyline Airways as a lost cause, but Robert saw potential. He saw an airline that could be transformed into something special. The negotiations had been going on for months. Lawyers, accountants, and business advisors had been working day and night to make the deal happen. Yesterday, after one final phone call, the paperwork was signed. Robert Johnson was now the proud owner of Skyline Airways. He owned every plane, every route, and every employee. It was the biggest moment of his business career, and hardly anyone knew about it yet. Today's flight to Miami wasn't just any flight. It was going to be Robert's first trip as the owner of an airline. He planned to meet with the management team, tour the facilities, and start planning how to turn the struggling company around. He had so many ideas: newer planes, better customer service, improved safety protocols, and most importantly, treating every passenger with respect and dignity. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. First class, seat 2A. He had always believed that if you were going to do something, you should do it right. This flight was going to be the beginning of a new chapter in his life, and he wanted to celebrate it properly. As he walked through the busy airport, Robert thought about all the changes he wanted to make at Skyline Airways. He had studied the company's customer service records and knew they had problems. Too many passengers complained about rude staff, delayed flights, and poor treatment. Robert believed that an airline was more than just a way to get from one place to another. It was about making people feel valued and respected during their journey. The gate area for Skyline Airways Flight 447 was buzzing with activity. Business. Travelers were typing on their laptops, Families were keeping their children entertained and flight attendants were preparing for boarding. Robert found a seat near the window and opened his briefcase to review some documents one more time. Inside the briefcase were the signed ownership papers, financial projections for the next 5 years, and a detailed plan for improving the airline. Robert had worked with some of the best consultants in the industry to develop a strategy that could make Skyline Airways profitable within 18 months. It wouldn't be easy, but Robert had never backed down from a challenge. He looked around at the other passengers and wondered what their stories were. The woman sitting across from him kept checking her phone nervously. Maybe she was traveling for a job interview. The elderly man reading a newspaper might be visiting his grandchildren. The young couple sharing headphones could be going on their honeymoon. Every person had a reason for flying, and Robert wanted to make sure their experience was as good as possible. At 8:45 a.m., the gate agent announced that boarding would begin in 15 minutes. Robert closed his briefcase and stood up, straightening his tie. He was excited about what lay ahead, but he was also thinking about his parents. His father had worked in a factory for 40 years, and his mother had cleaned office buildings at night to help support the family. They had always taught Robert to treat everyone with kindness and respect, no matter who they were or what they looked like. Hard work and good character will take you anywhere you want to go, his father used to say. Robert had carried those words with him throughout his entire career, and they had proven to be true. As Robert walked toward the boarding area, he felt a sense of pride and anticipation. In just a few hours, he would be in Miami, ready to begin the most important business adventure of his life. He had no idea that the next few minutes would test everything he believed about fairness, dignity, and standing up for what was right. The boarding announcement echoed through the gate area, and Robert reached for his boarding pass one more time. First-class passengers were invited to board first, and Robert was ready to take his seat on what he hoped would be a smooth flight to his new future. He had worked too hard and come too far to let anything stop him now. Little did he know that his journey was about to become much more complicated than he had ever imagined. Robert walked confidently toward the boarding counter, his first-class boarding pass in hand. The gate agent, a woman in her 30s with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked up as he approached. Her name tag read Jessica, and she had been working for Skyline Airways for almost 3 years. Jessica had seen thousands of passengers come and go, but something about Robert made her pause. She glanced at his boarding pass, then looked at his face, then back at the boarding pass again. Her friendly smile from moments before seemed to freeze on her face. Robert noticed the change immediately but chose to remain patient. He had encountered situations like this before in hotels, restaurants, and even other airports. He had learned that staying calm usually resolved things quickly. "Good morning," Robert said politely, handing over his boarding pass and identification. "I'm ready to board when you are." Jessica took the documents but didn't look at them right away. Instead, she seemed to be studying Robert's appearance, taking in his expensive suit, his polished shoes, and his confident demeanor. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. "Sir, I need to double-check something with this ticket," Jessica said slowly, her voice carrying a tone that Robert immediately recognized. It was the same tone he had heard countless times over the years, a mixture of suspicion and disbelief that someone like him could afford something like a first-class ticket. Robert's heart sank a little, but his expression remained calm and professional. "Of course, take your time. Is there a problem with the booking?" Jessica didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned to her computer and began typing, though Robert could see she wasn't actually looking up his reservation. She was stalling, and they both knew it. Other first-class passengers had already begun boarding, walking past Robert with their tickets barely being glanced at. A businessman in a wrinkled shirt and coffee-stained tie walked up behind Robert. Jessica immediately brightened when she saw him, taking his boarding pass with a warm smile and waving him through without any questions. The man's ticket was also first class, but Jessica didn't ask for additional identification or express any concerns about his reservation. Robert watched this interaction and felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. After all these years of success, after building companies worth millions of dollars, after proving himself time and time again, he was still facing the same prejudices that had followed him since childhood. "Ma'am," Robert said gently, "I've been standing here for several minutes now. Is there something specific you need from me?" Jessica looked uncomfortable but didn't back down. She waved over her supervisor, a man in his 40s named Tony who had been working for the airline for over a decade. Tony had seen his share of difficult situations, but something about Jessica's nervous expression told him this might be more complicated than usual. "What's going on here?" Tony asked, approaching the counter with authority. Jessica leaned in close to Tony and whispered something that Robert couldn't quite hear, but he caught enough words to understand what was happening. Words like suspicious and verify and doesn't look right floated over to him, each one stinging more than the last. Tony looked at Robert with the same suspicious expression that Jessica had worn. He reached for Robert's boarding pass and identification, examining them as if he were a detective investigating a crime scene. The documents were perfectly legitimate. Robert had purchased the ticket himself using his platinum credit card just 2 days earlier. "Sir, we're going to need some additional verification," Tony announced loudly enough for other passengers to hear. Sometimes people try to upgrade their tickets without proper authorization, if you know what I mean. Robert felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to remain composed. He had worked too hard and come too far to let his emotions get the better of him now. "What kind of additional verification do you need? I have my credit card, my driver's license, and I can show you the confirmation email on my phone." Several passengers in line behind Robert were beginning to notice the commotion. Some looked annoyed at the delay, while others seemed curious about what was happening. A few people had already pulled out their phones, though Robert couldn't tell if they were just checking messages or recording what was unfolding. Tony and Jessica huddled together at the counter, speaking in hushed tones while Robert waited. He could see them glancing at him periodically, and he knew they were trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Part of him wanted to simply walk away and catch a different flight, but a larger part of him knew that walking away would only reinforce their behavior. An elderly woman behind Robert in line spoke up. "Excuse me, but some of us have connecting flights to catch. Could you please handle this more quickly?" Tony looked annoyed at the interruption. "Ma'am, we're following standard security procedures. This will just take a few more minutes." But it wasn't standard procedure, and everyone knew it. The businessman with the coffee-stained tie had been processed in less than 30 seconds. 3 other first-class passengers had walked through without any additional questions. Only Robert was being subjected to this extra scrutiny. "Look," Tony said, returning to Robert with a forced smile, "even if your ticket is legitimate, we have other first-class passengers who might be more comfortable if you took a seat in our premium economy section. It's really quite nice, and we'd be happy to refund you the difference in price." The suggestion hit Robert like a slap in the face. They weren't questioning his ticket anymore. They were asking him to give up his rightful seat to make other passengers more comfortable. The implication was crystal clear, and Robert felt 25 years of professional success crumbling around him. "I paid for a first-class ticket," Robert said firmly, his voice still controlled but with a steel edge that hadn't been there before. "I intend to sit in first class." Tony's expression hardened. He clearly wasn't used to passengers standing up to him, especially not in situations like this. "Sir, we reserve the right to refuse service to any passenger, and if you're going to be difficult about this—" "Difficult?" Robert interrupted, his composure finally beginning to crack. "I'm being difficult by expecting to receive the service I paid for?" The conversation was attracting more attention now. Passengers were openly staring, and Robert could see airline employees from other gates beginning to take notice. This was exactly the kind of situation that Robert had tried to avoid his entire career. But sometimes, there came a moment when a person had to take a stand. A young woman with a small child approached the counter. "Excuse me, but my daughter needs to use the restroom. How much longer is this going to take?" Jessica looked flustered. "We're just resolving a small issue with this gentleman's ticket." "His ticket looks fine to me." the woman said, glancing at Robert's documents which were still spread across the counter. Can't you just let him board so the rest of us can get on the plane? Tony was clearly feeling the pressure from the growing crowd of impatient passengers. He made a decision that would change everything. Reaching for his radio, he called for airport security, claiming there was a disruptive passenger situation at Gate 12. Robert's heart started racing. In all his years of business travel, he had never had security called on him. He looked around at the other passengers, many of whom were now openly recording the situation with their phones. This was about to become much bigger than a simple boarding dispute, and Robert knew that the next few minutes would define not just his flight to Miami, but possibly his entire future with the airline he now secretly owned. Robert's hands were steady, but his heart was pounding as he watched Tony speak into his radio. The words, "disruptive passenger," echoed in his mind, and he couldn't believe this was actually happening. In 45 years of life, he had never been called disruptive. He had built his entire career on being calm, professional, and respectful in every situation. The gate area was getting more crowded by the minute. Word was spreading quickly that something unusual was happening at Gate 12, and curious travelers from nearby gates were starting to gather. Some were holding their phones up, recording everything. Robert realized that whatever happened next would likely end up on social media within hours. 2 airport security officers appeared within minutes of Tony's call. The first officer was a tall man in his 50s named Officer Davis, who had been working airport security for over 15 years. He had seen every kind of passenger dispute imaginable, from drunk travelers to people trying to bring forbidden items through security. But as he approached the gate, something about this situation felt different. The second officer was younger, maybe in her 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene. Her name tag read, Officer Rodriguez, and she had a reputation for being fair but firm with difficult passengers. Both officers walked up to the counter where Robert was still standing with his documents spread out in front of him. "Good morning, officers," Robert said politely, extending his hand to shake theirs. "I'm Robert Johnson, and I'm not sure why you were called, but I'm happy to explain the situation." Officer Davis was immediately struck by Robert's calm demeanor and professional appearance. In his experience, truly disruptive passengers were usually agitated, loud, or clearly under the influence of something. Robert seemed like the opposite of those things. "Sir, we received a call about a passenger causing problems at this gate," Officer Davis said carefully. "Can you tell us what's going on?" Before Robert could answer, Tony jumped in. "Officers, this man is insisting on boarding with what we believe might be a questionable ticket situation. When we tried to offer him alternative seating, he became argumentative and refused to cooperate with our staff." Robert felt his blood pressure rising, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "Officer, that's not accurate. I have a legitimate first-class ticket that I purchased 2 days ago with my own credit card. I've provided all the documentation they requested, and I've remained polite throughout this entire interaction. I simply asked to board the flight that I paid for." Officer Rodriguez picked up Robert's boarding pass and identification from the counter. She examined them carefully, checking the dates, the seat assignment, and comparing the name on the ticket to his driver's license. Everything appeared to be completely legitimate. "These documents look perfectly fine to me," Officer Rodriguez said, looking at Tony and Jessica. "What exactly is the problem with this gentleman's ticket?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we just wanted to verify that the purchase was legitimate. Sometimes people, try to upgrade without authorization. But you've verified it, right?" Officer Davis asked. "You've checked his credit card and confirmed the purchase?" Tony and Jessica exchanged glances. The truth was, they hadn't actually checked anything. They had made assumptions based on Robert's appearance, and now they were being called out by airport security in front of a growing crowd of witnesses. An older gentleman who had been waiting in line finally spoke up. "Excuse me, officers, but I've been watching this whole thing, and these airline employees are clearly in the wrong. This man has been nothing but polite, and they've been treating him terribly for no good reason." A woman with 2 small children nodded in agreement. "I saw the whole thing too. They let other first-class passengers board without any questions, but they're giving this gentleman a hard time for no reason I can see. More passengers began speaking up, sharing what they had witnessed. The crowd was clearly on Robert's side, and many of them were openly expressing their displeasure with how the airline staff was handling the situation. Officer Rodriguez pulled Officer Davis aside for a quiet conversation. After a few moments, they both returned to the group gathered around the counter. "Mr. Johnson," Officer Davis said, "you have every right to board this flight with your valid ticket. Your documentation is completely in order, and from what we can see, you haven't done anything wrong here." He then turned to Tony and Jessica. "I need to ask you both directly. Is there any legitimate reason why this passenger cannot board with his first-class ticket?" Tony looked flustered. He knew he was in a difficult position, and the growing crowd of angry passengers wasn't making things any easier. "Well, no, but we have the right to refuse service if we feel—" "If you feel what?" Officer Rodriguez interrupted, her voice taking on a sharper tone. "This gentleman has valid documentation, he's been polite and cooperative, and multiple witnesses have confirmed that he's done nothing wrong. What exactly are you feeling that would justify refusing him service?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the gate area seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how Tony would respond. Several people were still recording with their phones, and Tony was beginning to realize that this situation was spiraling out of his control. A businesswoman in the crowd called out, "This is discrimination, plain and simple. I travel every week and I've never seen anything like this." Another passenger added, "I'm recording this whole thing and it's going straight to social media. This airline should be ashamed of themselves." Robert looked around at all the support he was receiving from complete strangers. People who didn't know him were standing up for what was right, and he felt a mix of gratitude and sadness. Gratitude that there were still good people in the world who would speak up against injustice, and sadness that this kind of situation still happened in 2024. Officer Davis made a decision. "Mr. Johnson, you're free to board your flight. Officers, please escort this gentleman to his seat to ensure there are no further issues." But Robert held up his hand. "Officers, I appreciate your help more than you know, but I think I need to handle this situation differently." He looked around at the crowd of passengers, many of whom were still holding up their phones, recording everything. He thought about his parents and the lessons they had taught him about standing up for what was right. He thought about his employees back in Chicago, who looked up to him as a leader. And he thought about the airline he now owned, and the changes he wanted to make. "I'd like to speak with someone from airline management," Robert said clearly, his voice carrying across the gate area. "This situation needs to be addressed at a higher level." Tony looked panicked. "Sir, that's really not necessary. I'm sure we can work this out right here." "No," Robert said firmly. "I don't think we can. This isn't just about me or this flight. This is about how this airline treats its passengers, and that's something that needs to be discussed with management." Officer Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's your right, Mr. Johnson. We can help facilitate that conversation if you'd like." As if on cue, a woman in a business suit appeared at the gate. She had clearly been called by someone who was watching the situation unfold, and she looked both concerned and determined to resolve whatever was happening. Robert didn't know it yet, but the next few minutes were about to change everything for Skyline Airways, for every person in that gate area, and most importantly for Robert himself. The moment of truth was finally arriving. The woman in the business suit walked quickly toward the gate, her heels clicking against the airport floor. She looked to be in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back professionally and an expression that showed she meant business. Her name tag identified her as Patricia Williams, customer service manager for the entire Denver airport location. Patricia had been in her office reviewing weekly reports when she received an urgent call from airport operations. They told her there was a serious situation developing at Gate 12 that needed immediate management attention. The caller mentioned something about discrimination complaints, social media recordings, and airport security involvement. Patricia knew that any combination of those words meant potential disaster for the airline. As she approached the crowd gathered around the gate, Patricia could see immediately that this was worse than she had imagined. At least 30 passengers were standing around watching the situation unfold, many of them holding up their phones to record everything. The two security officers looked professional but concerned, while the gate agents appeared nervous and defensive. In the center of it all stood a well-dressed black man who carried himself with quiet dignity, despite obviously being in the middle of a very difficult situation. Patricia had handled hundreds of passenger complaints over her 8 years with Skyline Airways, and she could usually tell right away who was at fault in any dispute. This time, her instincts told her that her own employees had made a serious mistake. "Good morning, everyone," Patricia said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "I'm Patricia Williams, the customer service manager here at Denver International. I understand there's been some kind of issue, and I'm here to resolve it immediately." She walked directly to Robert and extended her hand. "Sir, I apologize for whatever has happened here this morning. Can you please tell me your name and explain the situation from your perspective?" Robert shook her hand and was immediately struck by her professional demeanor and genuine concern. "Thank you, Ms. Williams. My name is Robert Johnson, and I'm simply trying to board Flight 447 to Miami with a first-class ticket that I purchased legitimately 2 days ago." Patricia turned to Tony and Jessica, both of whom looked like they wanted to disappear. "What exactly has been the problem with Mr. Johnson's ticket?" Tony started to speak, but his words came out jumbled and defensive. "Well, we were just following standard procedures to verify. I mean, sometimes people try to... We wanted to make sure..." "Make sure of what?" Patricia asked firmly. "Either the ticket is valid or it isn't. Have you verified his purchase in the computer system?" Jessica finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't actually check the system, we just thought..." Patricia felt her stomach drop. "You didn't check the system? Then how do you know there's a problem with his ticket, the queue?" Silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the gate area could see what had really happened here, and it wasn't pretty. Patricia looked at Robert's boarding pass and identification, then at Tony and Jessica, then at the crowd of angry passengers who were still recording everything. "Mr. Johnson," Patricia said, turning back to Robert, "on behalf of Skyline Airways, I want to offer you my sincere apology for this inexcusable treatment. There is absolutely nothing wrong with your ticket, and you should have been boarded 30 minutes ago without any questions." Robert nodded, but didn't smile. "Ms. Williams, I appreciate your professionalism, but I think there's something important. You should know about me and about this situation." Patricia looked puzzled. "Of course, please tell me whatever you think is relevant." Robert reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. The crowd leaned in closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even Tony and Jessica, despite their embarrassment, couldn't help but watch with curiosity. "Ms. Williams, 3 hours ago, I completed the purchase of Skyline Airways," Robert said calmly, opening the folder to reveal official legal documents. "As of this morning, I am the majority owner of this airline." The words seemed to echo through the gate area like a thunderclap. Patricia's face went completely white, and she had to steady herself against the counter. Tony's mouth fell open, and Jessica looked like she might faint. The passengers who had been recording suddenly realized they had captured something much bigger than a simple discrimination incident. Robert continued speaking, his voice steady and clear. "I was traveling to Miami today to meet with the management team and begin implementing changes to improve our customer service and company culture. I had planned to make minimal staff changes during the transition, believing that most problems could be solved through better training and clearer policies." An elderly woman in the crowd gasped audibly. "Oh my goodness, he owns the airline." A businessman who had been recording on his phone said loudly, "This is incredible. Are you getting this?" Patricia was struggling to process what she was hearing. "Mr. Johnson, I had no idea. The ownership transition wasn't supposed to be announced until next week." "That's correct," Robert said. "I wanted to observe our operations firsthand before making any public announcements. I wanted to see how we treat our customers when no one thinks the owner is watching." He looked directly at Tony and Jessica, both of whom appeared to be in shock. "What I've discovered today is deeply troubling. Not only did these employees discriminate against a paying customer, but they did so without even following basic verification. procedures. They made assumptions based solely on my appearance. Robert then addressed the crowd of passengers who had gathered. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank each of you who spoke up for what was right today. You didn't know who I was, but you stood up against unfair treatment anyway. That gives me hope that we can build something better here. A young mother holding a toddler called out, "What are you going to do about this? These employees shouldn't be allowed to treat people this way." Robert nodded. "You're absolutely right, and changes will be made immediately." Patricia finally found her voice again. "Mr. Johnson, please know that this behavior does not represent the values of Skyline Airways. I want to personally ensure that this situation is handled properly." "Ms. Williams," Robert said, "you've handled this situation with exactly the professionalism and respect that every customer deserves. You immediately apologized, you sought to understand what really happened, and you treated me with dignity. That tells me a lot about your character." He paused and looked around at all the faces watching him. "However, the same cannot be said for everyone here today. This incident has shown me that we have serious cultural problems that go beyond just training issues." Tony stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Johnson, sir, I want to apologize. We made a mistake, and I take full responsibility." Robert looked at Tony for a long moment. "The mistake you made wasn't just refusing to verify my ticket. The mistake was treating a human being poorly based on assumptions and prejudices. That's not something that can be fixed with a simple apology." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This had become much more than just a story about a difficult airline passenger. This was about justice, accountability, and the power of standing up for what's right. Officer Davis, who had been quietly observing everything, spoke up. "Mr. Johnson, I have to say I've never seen anything quite like this in 15 years of airport security. The way you've handled this situation with such dignity is remarkable." Robert smiled for the first time that morning. "Officer, my parents taught me that how you treat people when you have power says everything about who you really are. Today I learned that lesson applies whether people know you have power or not." The moment was about to become even more significant as Robert prepared to announce exactly what changes would be coming to Skyline Airways. Robert took a deep breath and looked around at all the faces staring back at him. The gate area had become completely silent, except for the distant sounds of other flights being announced throughout the airport. Everyone was waiting to hear what would happen next, and Robert knew that his words in the next few minutes would set the tone for everything that followed. "Patricia," Robert said, turning to face the customer service manager, "you handled this situation exactly the way I hope every Skyline Airways employee would handle it. You listened, you showed respect, and you worked to make things right. That kind of leadership is exactly what this company needs." Patricia was still processing everything that had happened, but she managed a professional smile. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I believe in treating every passenger with dignity, regardless of who they are. That's exactly the attitude we need to build this airline around," Robert continued. "Which is why I'd like you to stay after we resolve this immediate situation. I want to discuss your role in the new leadership structure we're going to implement." Patricia's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded professionally. She had always dreamed of advancing in her career, but she never imagined it would happen like this. Robert then turned his attention to Tony and Jessica, both of whom looked like they were about to be sick. The crowd of passengers was still watching, intently, and many were still recording with their phones. "Tony, Jessica," Robert said, his voice firm but not angry. "What happened here today represents everything that's wrong with the current culture at this airline. You made assumptions about a paying customer based solely on his appearance. You refused to follow basic verification procedures, and when challenged, you called security on someone who was simply asking to receive the service he had paid for." Tony tried to speak, but Robert held up his hand. "I'm not finished. What makes this even worse is that you did all of this in front of dozens of witnesses, including children who were watching how adults treat each other." A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Mommy, why were those people being mean to the nice man?" The innocent question seemed to cut through the tension and remind everyone of the bigger picture. Robert's expression softened slightly as he looked at the child. That's exactly the right question, son. No one should be treated poorly because of how they look. He turned back to Tony and Jessica. Effective immediately, you are both suspended pending a full investigation into this incident and your employment history. This kind of behavior has no place at Skyline Airways, and I won't tolerate it from anyone, regardless of how long they've worked here. Jessica started to cry, and Tony looked like he wanted to argue, but neither of them said anything. They both knew they had been caught red-handed, and with dozens of witnesses and video recordings, there was no way to explain away what had happened. Robert then addressed the crowd of passengers who were still gathered around the gate. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize to each of you for the delay and the uncomfortable situation you've had to witness. More importantly, I want to thank those of you who spoke up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to just look the other way. The elderly gentleman who had been one of the first to defend Robert stepped forward. Young man, you handled this situation with more class and dignity than most people could have managed. Your parents raised you right. Robert smiled genuinely for the first time that morning. Thank you, sir. That means more to me than you know. A businesswoman in the crowd called out. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Robert nodded, clearly having anticipated the question. That's an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked. Starting today, Skyline Airways will be implementing a comprehensive training program for all employees focused on diversity, inclusion, and respectful customer service. We'll also be establishing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior of any kind. He paused and looked around at all the faces watching him. But more than that, we're going to change the entire culture of this airline. We're going to make sure that every passenger, regardless of who they are or what they look like, feels valued and respected from the moment they book their ticket until they reach their destination. The crowd began to murmur approvingly, and several people started clapping. Officer Davis, who had been quietly observing everything, stepped forward. Mr. Johnson, I've been working airport security for 15 years, and I've never seen someone handle a situation like this with such grace and wisdom. You could have made this much worse for everyone involved, but instead you turned it into a teaching moment. Robert shook the officer's hand. Officer Davis, Officer Rodriguez, thank you both for your professionalism today. You treated me fairly, and with respect, even when you didn't know who I was. That's exactly how law enforcement should work. Officer Rodriguez nodded. We just did our job, sir, but it's nice to see it appreciated. Robert then made an announcement that surprised everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, because of the delay and inconvenience you've all experienced today, every passenger on Flight 447 will receive a full refund of their ticket price, regardless of whether you choose to continue with your travel plans or make other arrangements. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. People were amazed that not only had they witnessed an incredible story unfold, but they were also being compensated for their trouble. A young couple who had been on their way to their honeymoon in Miami approached Robert. Mr. Johnson, we can't believe what just happened here today. This gives us so much hope that there are still good people in the world who will do the right thing. Robert was touched by their words. Congratulations on your wedding, and I hope you have a wonderful honeymoon. This situation reminded me that standing up for what's right is always worth it, even when it's difficult. Patricia stepped forward with a tablet in her hands. Mr. Johnson, I've been coordinating with our operations team. We can delay the flight for 30 minutes to give passengers time to decide if they want to continue or make other arrangements, and we'll have customer service representatives here to help with rebooking if needed. Perfect, Robert said. And Patricia, I want you to personally oversee the customer service for everyone here today. Show them what excellent service looks like. As the crowd began to disperse and passengers started making decisions about their travel plans, Robert found himself standing with a small group of people who had been most vocal in supporting him during the confrontation. The elderly gentleman extended his hand. Son, I'm retired military and I've seen a lot of injustice in my day. What you did here today, staying calm and dignified while standing up for yourself, that took real courage. A mother with 2 young children approached. Mr. Johnson, my kids were watching everything that happened, and they asked me to thank you for showing them how to handle bullies. They said you were like a real-life superhero. Robert knelt down to speak to the children at their eye level. You know what makes someone a real superhero? It's not being strong or powerful. It's treating everyone with kindness and standing up for people who are being treated unfairly. The little girl nodded seriously. We'll remember that. 6 months later, Skyline Airways had become one of the most respected airlines in the industry. Robert had kept every promise he made that day at Gate 12. The comprehensive training program had been implemented across the entire company. Customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, and the airline was not only profitable, but had become a symbol of positive change in the industry. Robert kept his boarding pass from Flight 447 framed on his office wall, not as a trophy, but as a daily reminder of the responsibility that comes with leadership and the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. The story of that morning had become part of the company's training materials, helping new employees understand that their actions represent not just themselves, but the values of the entire organization. Tony and Jessica were ultimately terminated after the investigation revealed a pattern of similar behavior toward other passengers. However, Robert also established a fund to help former employees receive additional training and education, believing that people could change if given the right opportunities. The video recordings from that day had indeed gone viral on social media. But instead of becoming a story about discrimination and injustice, it became a story about dignity, leadership, and the power of doing what's right. Robert received thousands of messages from people around the world who were inspired by how he handled the situation. Most importantly, Skyline Airways flourished under Robert's leadership, proving that businesses could be both profitable and principled when they committed to treating all people with respect and dignity.